On the night of December 31st, the city of San Francisco was in full celebration. Christmas lights still shone brightly in the streets, and preparations for the New Year's Eve party were in full swing. But while the world celebrated the end of another cycle, Faby Hills was about to experience a moment that would change her life forever. She walked through the crowded streets with a growing sense of unease in her chest. The party in the central square would be epic, but something bothered her. Her heart was racing, and it wasn't from excitement. Since the beginning of the week, she had felt like she was being watched. Small details, like the wind whispering oddly in her ear, or a shadow that seemed to move in the corners, sent her mind spiraling into paranoia. Little things that together formed a disturbing mosaic. When she finally arrived at the square, surrounded by smiling people and loving couples, Faby felt a strange presence. It was almost tangible, as if the air around her had changed density. She looked around, searching for the source of the feeling, but everything seemed normal. The loud music, the people dancing, and the sound of fireworks filling the still, calm sky. In the crowd, her eyes were drawn to a man standing in the distance. He was tall, with pale skin and black hair that gleamed under the colorful lights. Faby felt a shiver run down her spine. He was watching her. His eyes, red like rubies, shone with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see right through her soul. Even from a distance, she knew this man was not ordinary. There was something supernatural about his presence. She tried to ignore it, but her body felt pulled toward him by an invisible force. It was as if the man was a magnet, and she was unable to resist. Without realizing it, her feet began to move toward him. Every step brought her closer to an unknown abyss, but it was impossible to stop. Her heart pounded in her chest, and a strange attraction mixed with fear took hold of her. When she finally stood face to face with him, time seemed to freeze. The crowd, the music, even the fireworks became a distant blur. His presence was all that filled the space around her. "Faby," he murmured, and his voice, smooth as silk, echoed in her mind. He knew her name. "Who are you?" Faby asked, trying to sound firm, but her voice came out weak. "You know who I am," he replied, tilting his head slightly, as if the mystery were obvious. "And you know why I'm here." Faby tried to step back, but her feet seemed glued to the ground. Fear now pulsed through her veins. "I don't know you," she lied. His red eyes gleamed, and a barely noticeable smile appeared on his lips. "Not yet, but you will." Before she could react, he stepped forward, coming so close that she could feel the coldness radiating from his body. Faby tried to scream, but her voice disappeared, swallowed by terror. Then he pulled her to him with a subtle, yet irresistible force. And then it happened. His lips touched hers. The world around Faby collapsed. A biting cold pierced through her body, and her mind was flooded with images of darkness, blood, and death. It was as if an ancient shadow was seeping into her soul. She was falling, losing herself in an abyss that seemed endless. When he finally pulled away, Faby's eyes were wide. She collapsed to her knees, feeling the blood drain from her body, while he watched her with the same predatory calm. "Welcome to my world," he whispered, his voice echoing like an eternal chant. Faby couldn't say anything. Her mind was struggling to process what had just happened. But one thing was clear. That man wasn't human. He was something much more dangerous, something that now had a connection with her that could never be undone. As the clock in the square struck midnight and fireworks exploded in the sky, Faby Hills, in the midst of a crowd celebrating the new year, was marked forever by the kiss of the most dangerous of predators. The kiss of a vampire. Faby was still on her knees, struggling to regain her senses. The cold in her body was almost unbearable, as if her blood had turned to ice. The colors around her seemed faded, and the sounds muffled. She tried to stand, but her muscles felt shaky and weak. The gaze of the man who had kissed her remained fixed on her, calm but intense. There was no emotion there, only a chilling silence. She finally managed to take a deep breath, forcing herself to her feet, though with difficulty. His red eyes, glowing like embers, followed her every move, patient but intent. Everything about him screamed danger, and yet there was something alluring that kept her feet planted where she stood. "Why did you do this?" Faby managed to ask, her voice hoarse and shaky. Fear still raced through her veins, but there was something else, something deeper, growing inside her that she couldn't identify. The man took a step forward, shortening the distance between them again, and this time, Faby didn't back away. She couldn't. She was trapped in that moment, in that night. "Because now, you belong to me," he said, without breaking eye contact. His words sounded like a decree, like an invisible bond had been tied between them that instant. And soon you'll understand what that means. Faby felt a wave of revulsion mixed with terror rise within her. She wanted to scream, to run away, but all she could do was stare at him, trying to make sense of what was happening. "I am not yours," she whispered, trying to sound defiant, but the weakness of her body betrayed her. The man tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing at the corner of his lips for the first time. "Not yet," he replied, with a disturbingly calm demeanor. "But you will be." Those words echoed in her mind like a grim warning, and Faby felt her body tremble. She didn't know what he was, but she knew he wasn't of this world. Everything about him, from the paleness of his skin to the menacing gleam in his eyes, screamed danger. He wasn't just a man, he was something beyond that, a predator. The sound of laughter and distant fireworks felt far away, as if the world around her had slipped out of reach, like she was trapped in an alternate reality where only she and that man existed. Faby fought against the sensation of being consumed by a deep darkness. Her heart was pounding, and her breathing was erratic. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice now a bit steadier. She needed answers. The man took another step forward, now just inches away. He raised his hand and, with an almost strange gentleness, touched her face. His touch was cold, sending a shiver through her body. "My name is Viktor," he finally revealed, giving her a piece of his identity. "And I've been alive for a very long time, longer than you can imagine." The air around them seemed to grow thicker, heavier. Viktor watched her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "I've seen many like you," he continued, his voice soft but laden with dark seriousness. "You can try to fight, try to run, but nothing will change what you're becoming." Faby stepped back, trying to pull away from him, but her body was still too weak. His words hit her like a blow. "What am I becoming?" she asked, a lump forming in her throat. "One of us," Viktor replied without hesitation. Those words fell on Faby like a sentence. One of us. She didn't need more explanation to understand what he meant. Vampire. He was a vampire, and somehow, in some way, she was now bound to this world of shadows and darkness. this," she murmured, stepping back again. Her body wanted to flee, but her mind was paralyzed with fear and confusion. "I'm not like you." Viktor watched her with cold patience, almost as if he was used to resistance, as if he knew this was just part of the process. "You have no choice, Faby. Now that I've marked you, the process has already begun. With every beat of your heart, you come closer to us." Faby felt a stab of desperation. It was like falling into a bottomless pit, being pulled into a darkness she couldn't escape. "No." She shook her head, denying it, fighting against the panic that was taking over her body. "I'll find a way. I'll run." Viktor sighed, as if he had heard those words countless times before. "You can try," he said calmly, "but it won't work. I will always find you." Those words sounded like a curse. Viktor began to retreat slowly, backing into the shadows of the square. But before disappearing completely, he gave her one last look, his red eyes gleaming in the dark. "We'll meet again," he said, "sooner than you think." And with that, he was gone, vanishing into the shadows as if he had never been there. Faby stood there, alone in the crowd. The people around her continued their celebrations, but for her, the world had changed. Her life had been turned upside down. Viktor's kiss had sealed her fate, and now she was plunged into an unknown world where danger lurked around every corner. Her mind was still trying to process what had just happened, but one thing was certain: her life would never be the same. Whatever Viktor had started that night was already running through her veins. Faby woke up the next day with a strange sensation, as if everything had been a bad dream. But reality was relentless. When she looked in the mirror, the deep shadows under her eyes and the pale glow of her skin reminded her of what had happened. Viktor was real. His kiss had changed everything, and now her fate seemed out of her control. She dressed quickly, trying to follow her routine. But as she walked through the streets of San Francisco, the feeling of being watched haunted her. Every person seemed to be hiding secrets. Every shadow seemed alive. She knew Viktor was watching her, waiting for the right moment to return. Faby decided she needed answers, but where would they come from? She couldn't simply ignore what was happening. Viktor had promised that she would become one of them, but she still held on to hope. She didn't want to transform into a creature of darkness, condemned to an eternity of shadows. Desperate, Faby went to the local library, an old building filled with stories and legends. She searched for anything at all, that could help her understand what was happening. Among the dusty books, she found a forgotten volume on vampires, an ancient text that spoke of legends and rituals of immortality. There, she read about the transformation. According to the book, for the process to be complete, a second meeting was required, where the vampire would share his blood with the victim. Only then would the bond be sealed. Until that moment, there was time to escape the dark fate. But the window was short, just 3 days. After that, Faby's body would no longer resist, and she would be irreversibly transformed into a creature of the night. Her heart raced. She had a chance. She couldn't run forever, but maybe there was a way to end it. As she continued reading, she found another passage that spoke of the only way to break the cycle: the death of the vampire who started the process. If Viktor died, the bond would be broken. But killing a vampire was no easy task. Time slipped away as Faby read, and when she finally looked up, the sun had already set, casting long shadows across the city. Faby knew Viktor would come looking for her, and this time she couldn't hide. That night, Faby felt a different energy in the air. She stood atop an isolated hill far from the city, holding a small silver knife, the only weapon the book said could harm a vampire. Her plan was risky, but it was all she had. Then she felt it. Viktor was close. The air around her grew colder, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. She turned, finding his red eyes glowing in the darkness. "I knew you'd be here," Viktor said, emerging from the shadows like a ghost. His voice was low, almost affectionate, but filled with a subtle threat. "Are you ready to accept your fate, Faby?" She gripped the handle of the knife, trying to control the fear rising inside her. "I won't become one of you. I won't let that happen." Viktor smiled slightly unsurprised. "You still don't understand, do you? This isn't something you can choose. It's in your blood now. Fighting will only make it harder." "I am not yours," Faby shouted, her hands trembling. "And I never will be." With a quick movement, Viktor lunged at her. Faby barely had time to react. As he grabbed her arm, the coldness of his touch shot through her body like an electric shock. But before he could do more, she raised the knife, and with all the strength she had, drove the blade into his chest. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Viktor stepped back, surprised. His eyes, once filled with confidence, now showed pain and disbelief. He looked at the knife lodged in his chest, then at Faby. "You," he began, but his voice faltered. Faby watched, still unable to believe what she had done. Viktor fell to his knees, his hands futilely trying to remove the blade. His blood, black as night, oozed from the wound, and then, with a final gasp, his body collapsed to the ground. The air around her felt lighter, as if a massive weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The cold that had accompanied her since Viktor's kiss began to slowly fade. Her hands were still trembling, but now from adrenaline and disbelief, she had killed him. Faby fell to her knees, exhausted, the weight of the night finally crashing down on her. Viktor was dead, and with that, the cycle had been broken. For a long moment, she remained there in silence, feeling the tears run down her face. They weren't tears of sadness, but of relief. She had won. She was free. When she finally stood up, Viktor's body had already begun to disintegrate, turning into dust carried away by the night wind. She looked toward the horizon, where the first lights of the city began to glow again. A new life awaited her, a life far from the darkness. Faby Hills had faced the most dangerous of predators, and won.